The Kentucky Derby field is set, and the top two horses in the Distaff division go at it at Oaklawn. That and more on this episode of the Win Place Show. Salutations and welcome, friends. I'm your host of this episode of the Win Place Show. My name is Matthew DeSantis, and you can find me on Twitter at the handle at Failed to Menace. Well, thanks so much for tuning into this episode of the Win Place Show, where we recap all of the big races in the sport going back over the weekend and the last week. We keep you up to date with all of the latest news of horse racing and handicapping that's going on out there. And before we get any further, quick reminder, press that subscribe button here on YouTube to subscribe to all the great content we have on Trust the Profits. We have so much Derby content coming for you to get you ready for the Run for the Roses, the Run for the Triple Crown. We have barn tours. We have horse profiles. We have experts from across the horse racing industry coming on, joining us, answering questions, graded stakes previews, international racing, live betting. If you love horse racing, this is your one-stop shop for all of your needs. So, like I said, press that subscribe button, press the like button on this video. Always helps us spread the word to others who love the sport, and comment below with what was your biggest takeaway from this past weekend in horse racing. Well, before we get into the recap, I do want to just say and encourage everyone to join me in the 20 for 20 campaign that is going to kick off on Monday, April 17th. This is a campaign that I spoke about before. I had a video. If you go back and look at our video archives, you can find a little bit more information about it. But in the 20 days leading up to the Kentucky Derby, I will be giving $20 to 20 different thoroughbred aftercare charities and programs as a way of highlighting the great work they do and promoting how we can continue to take care of the horses that we love so much in this sport. $20 isn't a lot, I know, but it's a start, and it's the idea that it's enough money that other people can join in with me. It's not so cost prohibitive. You're spending more than that on a pick five ticket a lot of times. So maybe skip one pick five ticket this week and think about giving to a thoroughbred charity. Like I said, $20, 20 days leading up to the Kentucky Derby to 20 different aftercare programs in honor, of course, of the 20 horses in the Kentucky Derby starting gate. You can find all the information you'd like on my Twitter profile at Failed to Menace. If you join me in this, I'd really appreciate it. Even if you can only give $5 to one organization one day, that's honestly, folks, that's a start, and that's helping things move in the right direction. Really appreciate all your support through that. We also have some wonderful fans of Trust the Profits who are actually donating their own artwork. Dave Barista, have to give a huge shout out to him. He has put all this artwork together that we're going to be auctioning off and giving away to people who give the biggest donations throughout this charity drive. So if you're interested, like I said, check out Failed to Menace on Twitter. I'll be dropping a new organization every single day, showing my donation and letting you know a little bit about each of those organizations. Okay. Well, thank you for giving me the time to talk about that a little bit before we get into the race recap. And what a weekend of racing it was. We'll start at Keeneland on Friday. And this is where we saw the Limestone Stakes sprint, 5.5 furlongs on the turf for 3-year-old fillies. And let me tell you something, folks. Wesley Ward is back. Love Reigns sneaks up the inside rail. Absolutely brilliant timed ride. Some luck involved as well. That rail opening up, but Love Reigns just looked like she had so much left in the tank and was able to sneak up that inside rail to win the Limestone Stakes. Lady Hollywood finishing a very close-up second. That's a filly that got hammered at the polls and at the windows, I should say, was 15-1 morning line, got bet all the way down to 3-1, and honestly ran like a 3-1 long shot. Normally, Nick Tamaro, who does the morning lines at Keeneland, typically does a good job. I feel like there are one or two this weekend that he was a little off on, Lady Hollywood being one of those. But I think by and large, Nick does a really good job. And honestly, setting the morning line is a task that is thankless, in my opinion, and is not one that I would ever want to undertake. So the fact that anybody does it, thank God that we have him out there. And like I said, I think Nick does as good a job as anybody. But that was one where you knew that horse was really going to get hammered, and she did. She never stopped taking money the entire time the windows were open. And like I said, she ran a really valiant race for second place there to Love Reigns. But the big headliner on Friday at Keeneland was, of course, the Maker's Mark Mile. And folks, this was the return of modern games, the horse that I think his reputation has, I don't want to say become outsized, but he has been in our consciousness as a horse more so than maybe any other European horse because of what happened 2 years ago at the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf at Del Mar when he gets accidentally scratched from the race, gets put back in the race, but for prize money only, and ends up winning. And ever since then, Modern Games has become a horse I think a lot of American horse racing fans know, follow, and are a little bit obsessed about. And it has helped that he has come back as a 3-year-old dominant, wins the Woodbine Mile in dominant fashion, comes back, wins the Breeders' Cup Turf, and now comes back as a 4-year-old in the Maker's Mark Mile and has obviously William Buick, Charlie Appleby, the trainer's top jockey, up on the mount. But this was all about pace. And this was a race that I think was a great example of how you can spend hours handicapping something, and the second the gates open, something else happens. And I say that because the horse that I think most of us anticipated to be on the lead or very close to the lead was Emmanuel. Emmanuel blows the break and is dead last. This allows for Chez Paris and Dr. Zimpf to go out to the lead. Now, this was a very interesting race if you've not watched it. Chez Paris, who was jockeyed by Flavien Prat, who, by the way, apparently remembered how to ride horses from California to Keeneland this year. His demise was slightly overstated, only winning, I think, 11 or 12% out in California. I think he's winning close to 50% at Keeneland this meet so far. I mean, he is just absolutely raking. So Chez Paris goes out and gets the lead going into the first turn, around the first turn, and even about a quarter to a third of the way down the backstretch. But you can tell that Dr. Zimpf is incredibly rank, throwing his head, not happy at all about sitting second. So a quarter to a third of the way down the backstretch, Dr. Zimpf just goes and goes right by Chez Paris, who just stays kind of in his gallop, and goes and opens up 4 or 5 lengths on Chez Paris, who, oh, by the way, has opened up 6, 7 lengths on everybody else. And this was a great example of using speed to your advantage. And you spread the field out in such a way, you just open up so much space that it's hard for these horses coming from the back, especially when you're talking about a high grade 1 caliber type of horse. These are horses that can sustain a certain amount of pace. And Chez Paris ultimately reels back in Dr. Zimpf, who starts to fade, and it just gets the jump on the entire field. And you can tell that Buick on Modern Games is really going hard on Modern Games to move much, much sooner than Modern Games is normally accustomed to moving. And that's exactly what happened. Was you put everybody else on their back foot because suddenly they're having to make their move well before they would normally have to make their move because you've opened up such a margin on the rest of the field. And listen, Chez Paris, talk about a reverse. I mean, this was a horse that was absolutely due for a form improvement over last time out. Rick came into a lot of trouble. I think we saw a big jockey upgrade with Flavien Prat there, and he gave the perfect ride to that horse and ended up winning the field, winning the Grade 1 Maker's Mark Mile. Modern Games futilely ends up finishing second by about 3.5 lengths, followed very closely by about a half a length by Up to the Mark, the Todd Pletcher horse that I'm really high on, only his 3rd time ever on the turf. And so a stunner, truly, in the Maker's Mark Mile. But again, a lot of that was dictated by the fact Emmanuel blows the break. If Emmanuel doesn't blow the break, how's that race change, right? Now, it doesn't mean Chez Paris is not going to win, but the race dynamics is going to be different for sure. The pace is going to be a little bit different for sure. Just the race shape is going to look a little bit different. The way they're spread out is probably going to look a little bit different. There's a lot of things that are going to change if Emmanuel gets to the lead. And so, but that's the volatility and that is the unpredictability of horse racing. Is you can have it all worked out in your head. You can have it all worked out on paper. The second those gates open, it's in the hands of the horses and the jockeys. And that's not something you can always calculate. And that's not always something you can 100% bank on. So taking nothing away from Chez Paris, who, like I said, Pratt had the perfect ride. That horse ran a beautiful, beautiful race, deserving Grade 1 winner. But obviously a huge upset there of Modern Games in the Maker's Mark Mile. Well, let's move to Keeneland on Saturday. That, of course, featured the final of the Kentucky Derby prep races that led to the solidification of the field of 20 as it stands now. Obviously, there will be defections and things like that. We'll get to that in a second. But just to run through all of the stakes action on Keeneland on Saturday, we start off with the Giants Causeway, 5.5 furlong turf sprint for 3-year-old Nut Filly and mares. And wow, was Twilight Gleaming much the best in that race. Coming off a really long layoff, 6-month layoff, had not run since October 16th, comes back, runs on April 15th, obviously, on Saturday, and looked so good. And here's what I loved about Twilight Gleaming in that particular race. Showed a new dimension. Typically, you look at the running lines of Twilight Gleaming, she needs to be on the lead. She wants to be on the lead. Even when she fades, she wants to be on the lead. And it's led to her being vulnerable to early pace pressure, I think. You saw that last time out where she gets pressured and hounded in that last half furlong, she can start to lose some ground. What does she do this time around as a little bit of an older, a little bit more of a mature horse? She sits. She lets somebody else go out in front. She sits in a more of a stalking position and trip. She looms up around the far turn, and Irad knew how much he had in her because he didn't even ask. I mean, he did not even ask until they were well into the home stretch. Then he just pushes down, and she responds beautifully and just really, like I said, pulled away from the rest of the field. So much the best that day. Really kind of a big cluster there for about 2nd through 5th or 6th, all kind of finished with the blanket over them. So the takeaway here is Twilight Gleaming really showing her stuff. Now, it would be fun to potentially to see her and Caravel run against each other. But of course, Caravel is too busy beating the boys on the turf sprints. So it'll be interesting to see if we see a Twilight Gleaming Caravel showdown at some point in the future. Well, let's move on to the Lexington Stakes, that final Kentucky Derby prep race. And this was all about Brad Cox, folks. This was about First Mission. What a beautiful race this horse ran. Obviously had just broken his maiden last time out, had lost to another Cox horse, Bishop's Bay, in his debut. We're going to get back to that horse in a second. But very impressive stalking trip, sitting behind the early pace, then moving out and confronting Arabian Lion, who was on the lead on the inside rail, goes up. Arabian Lion with Irad Ortiz Jr. aboard comes veering over to try to intimidate a little bit. Some people didn't like that. Some people think it's just good racing. Some people thought it was very dangerous. I'm kind of in the middle on that one, and we'll talk a little bit more about Irad in a second because I don't want this to take away from First Mission, who just blew by Arabian Lion coming down the stretch. Arabian Lion, I will say, ran a much better race than I was anticipating, but Baffert now 0 for 10 in the last 5 years at Keeneland in graded stakes races with their horses off Lasix. Something to keep in mind, something to keep in your back pocket as you continue to think and look at Baffert horses shipping to Keeneland. But listen, First Mission earns a 98 buyer speed figure, but First Mission is not going to be in the Kentucky Derby because First Mission did not earn enough points, only earned 20 points, which is all the winner of the Lexington gets. Obviously not anywhere near enough to get into the starting field. Right now, the cutoff is around 40 points to get into or 45 points, I should say, to get into the starting gate. So nowhere close to being able to get ready. But this shows you how good Brad Cox's barn is. I mean, Cox has 3 horses in the starting 20 of the Kentucky Derby. He's got Jace's Road sitting there at 21. If somebody defects, he's going to draw in. He's got Instant Coffee at 28-29, who many of us thought was one of the best horses in the 3-year-old crop until he turned in a nothing performance at the Louisiana Derby, which, by the way, wasn't entirely his fault, given the incredibly slow fractions that took place up front. And he's a closer and needs a little bit of a pace to run into. Then the horse that beat both First Mission and the other Cox runner in the Lexington, Demolition Duke, is Bishop's Bay. Bishop's Bay wasn't even running, and he might be one of the most talented of Cox's entire crop this year. I mean, his crop is just incredibly deep at this point. And I know I engaged in some discussion earlier this year about who had the better 3-year-old crop, Brad Cox or Bob Baffert. And the answer might end up being Todd Pletcher. But between Cox and Baffert, I mean, I don't think it's much contest at this point. I mean, Baffert's horses, aside from some of them, I mean, we've not seen Cave Rock since the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. National Treasure finished a 4th, kind of an unimpressive 4th last time out. Hijazi's a sprinter. I think American Lion is probably better as a sprinter. you look at some of these other horses that have been transferred, Reincarnate, 2 consecutive third place finishes. Okay, looks fine. But, Newgate hasn't been running. Again, it's just not a lot there, in my opinion, at Baffert's Barn for this 3-year-old crop. We'll see. I mean, there's obviously a lot of the year left, but it leaves a little bit to be desired, in my opinion. I think, Cox has a much deeper barn at this point. But like I said, Pletcher might end up having the better top end, so to speak, with Forte and Kings Barnes and Tapit Trice. So really exciting stretch run there. Now, here's the thing. The news coming out of this race was it did have an impact on the Kentucky Derby because Disarm, the Steve Asmussen gun runner, finishes third, earns 6 points, just enough to move Disarm from out to in. So Disarm moves into the starting gate of the Kentucky Derby with 46 points. That moves Jace's Road out down to 21st. So it's going to go Jace's Road, then Skinner, the John Sheriff's horse out in California. I think a lot of us are very, very high on. So if there's a couple defections, I think he's a very, very serious horse to consider. Cyclone Mischief, who would add to the pace if he gets into the race, I think, for Dale Romans. Then you're looking at a horse like Major Dude, who is not going to be pointed towards the Kentucky Derby by all accounts. But he does have the next amount of points, but would obviously be skipped over. And then the Japanese horse Mandarin Hero, who finished second at the Santa Anita Derby. So if there are some defections, you might get 3 Japanese horses into the Kentucky Derby with Mandarin Hero. That would obviously be a huge storyline. But like I said, I think Skinner is an important horse potentially who could draw in. And I think Cyclone Mischief's an important horse to draw in. Even if I don't think he's going to be around at the end, he's a horse that could contribute to a stronger pace. Look out for a video that Colin Sheehan and I are doing. First look at the Kentucky Derby. We're going to talk about pace. And folks, there's not much. There is not much in this Kentucky Derby. So interesting that Disarm, like I said, draws in. It was a very unimpressive third place finish. I had spoken with Colin about this during our first look at the Lexington. I didn't think he was going to be all the way cranked up. I didn't think he was going to be all the way kind of back from the Louisiana Derby. This is a young horse who just was asked to run 1 mile and 3/16. They bring him back on 3 weeks rest and run him at 1 mile and 1/16. And quite frankly, he looked like a little bit of a tired horse. He finished third. That's basically based upon his class, I think, more than anything else. But is he really going to have something in 3 more weeks for the Kentucky Derby? I don't know. And he may very well be a candidate that ends up getting dropped out of this and defecting from the race as well. But he's just a horse I can't get excited about based upon that performance. Like I said, the Lexington, I always feel like you're threading a needle putting a horse in the Lexington. And that was really, like I said, it's a tough thing to bring him back on 3 weeks to get him ready for another race in 3 weeks when these horses have never run on that quick of a turnaround before. Every horse is different. Some horses can handle those quick turnarounds. Other horses can't. Steve Asmussen, the best in the business, obviously all-time winningest trainer in North America, but still not a big fan of this. Now, some people said after the race, was this a referendum on Kings Barnes and the Louisiana Derby? Disarm, of course, finishing second in that Louisiana Derby to Kings Barnes. And people said, should we downgrade the Louisiana Derby now? I don't think so. That's not the takeaway I would have from this race. Like I said, Disarm was up against it from a timing standpoint and from just a fatigue standpoint. I think this was a lot to throw at a young horse. That I don't think has any reflection of how was that Louisiana Derby field? How was Kings Barnes? How do you downgrade or upgrade those performances? I don't want to read too much into it just because it's such a unique situation. Now, the race that I would fade, that I think most people are already fading, is the Wood Memorial. Wow, was that beat up over the weekend by the Lexington Stakes. I say this because Prairie Hawk was a horse that also ran in the Lexington, but this is a horse that beat Lord Miles last time out at the Tampa Bay Derby. Lord Miles, of course, goes on to win the Wood Memorial. Then we see Prairie Hawk come back and run at the Lexington and run, I think, 5th or 6th in that race. Additionally, you have a horse like Empire Strikes Fast, who beat another horse, Dreamlike, in maiden debut. Dreamlike goes up to the Wood Memorial, finishes in a photo for the win, basically, but ends up getting third in that race. Empire Strikes Fast fades to the back late. So if you just look at the transitive property of how the different horses responded to horses that beat each other, it's hard to be particularly impressed by Lord Miles, and Dreamlike based upon what we just saw out of Prairie Hawk and Empire Strikes Fast in Lexington. Now, I don't think a lot of people were thinking that Wood Memorial was particularly strong, but it gives you all the more reason perhaps to fade some of the runners coming out of that, Lord Miles and obviously Hit Show, the other horse that finished second coming out of that race, who also won the Withers. Well, I don't want to spend too much time in the Lexington because we had another fantastic race in the Jenny Wiley Grade 1 race. I was really, really excited for this race. And then the day of the race happened and I saw all the scratches. And that was unfortunate. There were several scratches in the race that really changed the pace dynamics. A lot of horses that were going to be pretty forwardly placed and may challenge in Italian, the very, very talented Chad Brown mare up front, who obviously likes to go out in the lead, set her own fractions and go. A lot of those horses scratched. And suddenly you're looking at the field and it becomes pretty inevitable that an Italian's going to win the race. And this is one of the things, when I do handicapping videos, 48, 72 hours before the race, there are scratches then. And then that changes the complexion of the race. And this was one of them. If you had showed me the race as it ended up on Saturday, I'd tell you, well, single in Italian, because this is going to be really tough for With the Moonlight for Charlie Appleby and William Buick. And indeed it was. In Italian, she looked phenomenal, first of all, off the layoff. I don't want to take anything away. The scratches weren't the only reason she won. She looked absolutely spectacular, setting solid fractions the whole way around and had more than enough at the end. With the Moonlight, finishes a driving second with White Frost, the Bill Mott horse, finishing third. That horse is going to be a good horse, by the way, White Frost. She's going to win some grade 2, grade 3 races, I think, this year. Finishing third to those two in Italian and With the Moonlight, there's no disrespect there. I think White Frost is a nice horse. I'll be eager to see where she goes to next, but no competition for the top two, obviously, who are two of the best in the filly mare turf division in the world right now. So that was a real treat to see that. But in Italian, hats off to her. Obviously, huge win for the Chad Brown barn there. Well, let's shift to Oaklawn on Saturday, and there were two really interesting stakes races. The first was the Count Fleet Sprint handicap, and that was won by Skelly. Now, what's funny is if you go back and watch one of my capping the cards, I think from February, where I capped Oaklawn, Skelly was actually one of my value plays in an allowance race. And I really like this horse. And it was like, oh, a young ascending horse, increasing speed figures. You know my shtick. I like those types of horses. Well, Skelly comes out, wins that race, then comes back and wins another optional claimer and posts this huge speed figure, then goes to the Count Fleet Stakes, runs up against some nice competition in Strobe and Tejano Twist. And just was the speed of the speed. Just got out there from the number 2 hole, got out there on the lead with Ricardo Santana Jr. aboard and set some early fractions, but was unpressured. I always talk about how there's a difference between fast fractions and pressured fractions. That a horse can run fast on the front end, but sometimes if that horse doesn't feel other horses around him, even though they're running fast, they can sustain that. It's when horses are sometimes pressured by another horse, even if they're not running as fast, they get bothered by another horse being there in some instances. And so pressure versus pace is always something that I think is an interesting dynamic to discuss. But Skelly got out there on the lead and was just see you later and was able to wire the field, took him gate to wire, had more than enough. Tejano Twist and Strobe coming late, finishing second and third respectively. But it was, like I said, a very, very impressive effort over Tejano Twist, who's kind of started to assert himself as one of the better sprint horses in the division. And Strobe, who I think is also a pretty nice horse. So, congrats to Skelly. A lot of patience there for Steve Asmussen, demonstrated that the last speed figure was very much so legitimate. This is a horse that had just had a lot of issues and was trying to find the right footing, the right setting, the right dynamics. It was trying to get healthy, finally got healthy, got in the right settings, got the right distance, got the right footing, got the right level, and now is ready to roll and looks to be one of our better sprint horses in the division. Very exciting. Speaking of very exciting, the Apple Blossom Stakes. My gosh, what a race this was to close out things at Oaklawn Park on Saturday. Wasn't the final race on the card, but final stakes race on the card. 4-horse field. And you're thinking, how impressive can a 4-horse field be? This was as good as it's going to get coming down to the stretch. You had Halton Sultry, who just decided we're going to run in a turf race, and who just opens up multiple lengths on the field, going around the first turn, going down the back stretch. Secret Oath sitting second, Clairiere sitting third. What was amazing was you saw 4 or 5 lengths between first and second. You saw another 4 or 5 lengths between second and third. You saw another 4 or 5 lengths between third and fourth. I mean, they were completely strung out. It was the opposite of what you see a lot of times in small field races where they're all clumped up together. There was no clumping up in this race. They were spread out as spread out can be. Secret Oath makes a little bit of an earlier move and starts reeling in Hot and Sultry on the front end. And eventually gets past Hot and Sultry, going around the turn, heading for home, gets the lead. And you think, okay, Secret Oath has got this thing put away. And you see Rosario and you see Clairiere just, pumping away as she always does, just coming late with that late charge, that late kick, that late grind of just trying to get there. And she just keeps making up ground. I'll be honest, at the 8th pole, I thought she might finish a close second. At the 16th, I still didn't think she was going to get there. And somehow at the very end, Clairiere gets there for the win over Secret Oath, gets her third grade 1 race and wins the Apple Blossom. I mean, absolutely incredible, thrilling race. I could not believe it. It was just so great. I mean, Clairiere's she's a mare that I absolutely love. I picked her in the Breeders' Cup Distaff. It's one of the more amazing statistics that she's lost the last 2 Breeders' Cup Distaffs by less than a combined length and yet only hit the board 1 time. She is just kind of the equivalent of a hard luck horse sometimes, but she puts her all out there. She's beautifully bred, and she ran a hell of a race. And I was not sure if a 4-horse field was going to set up well for her because she does like a little bit of pace, but Hot and Sultry gave that to her. Secret Oath moved, I think, a little earlier than people were anticipating. And then Clairiere just grinds away. That long stride just keeps elongating because she can take all the ground she wants. And ultimately gets there at the end. So impressive to see that win for Clairiere. And of course, if you were watching live, you saw Steve Asmussen just running around. It kind of reminded me a little bit of Jimmy Valvano and the NC State National Championship team in 1983, just kind of running around looking for somebody to hug, looking for somebody to congratulate. It was absolutely incredible performance. Maggie Wolfendale from Fox Sports and Naira down there at Oaklawn interviews Asmussen afterwards. And you can tell, you can tell he's choked up when he's talking about her, about how much she means to the barn and how much it means that the ownership group lets her come back and run as a 5-year-old. And it is great. I mean, this is why the distaff division is one of the best, if not the best in the sport, because they let these fillies and mares run to 4, run to 5, run to 6. They let them run for a while, and fans can develop passions around these horses and fan clubs around these horses. It means so much when you can develop a fandom around these horses. And Clairiere is a perfect example of that. Secret Oath is a perfect example of that. Malathat was a perfect example of that. Latruska was a perfect example of that. These are horses. Swiss Skydiver was a perfect example of that. Even going to other divisions, when they stick around for a long time, Old Man Whitmore, right? I mean, there are certain horses that just develop cult followings that people love. Rated R Superstar, now a 10-year-old still running, okay? Art Collector. These are horses that people start to form bonds with because they see them over and over and over again. A horse that won this weekend, I'd be remiss not to mention, Barber Road. I mean, come on. He's the equivalent of a horse. People love horses like Barber Road that just always come up short. Finally gets a win this weekend in an allowance race. By the way, he wanted to hang in that race, but Principe de Oro, who he finally beat, was pretty tired. And you could tell just kind of gave it up there the last little stretch. But congrats to Barber Road, because that was another great win. But, Oaklawn on Saturday was all about the Clairiere in the Apple Blossom. Well, that said, the best ride that I saw this weekend was not at Oaklawn, was not at Keeneland, despite how good Clairiere was, despite how good Flavien Prat was on Chez Paris. The best ride I saw this weekend was Fergal Lynch in the Tesio Stakes at Laurel Park, which was a win-and-near-in race for the Preakness, which, by the way, is pretty sure we're First Mission, who won the Lexington. That's where he's going next as well. But Perform, the Shug McGahee horse that was jockeyed by Fergal Lynch, easily one of the best rides I've ever seen. I saw it compared to the Rich Strike ride in the Kentucky Derby last year. I'll be honest, even better. because this was one of the more amazing rides I've ever seen. And the home stretch at Laurel is pretty long, especially when they run to the second finish line. And it is, I mean, there was a lot going on there. So Perform comes from the back and starts to navigate, but has to navigate around a fatiguing horse, the number 3 horse, Fletcher. Now, while he's trying to do this, he has to also kind of thread the needle between Fletcher and Prince of Jericho, who's the Brittany Russell horse, who was the favorite in the race. Then he dives to the inside, which is where you see that similarity to Rich Strike, but then gets past a group of about 5 horses, but realizes he's going to get cut off by the winner, or by 90% Maddie, who was in the lead at that point, and veers back outside, but manages to do it in a very safe way. I mean, he's not putting anybody at risk, but manages to weave back out about 2 more paths and then gets past and gets up in time just to nab 90% Maddie. Folks, if you didn't see the highlights of this, go back. I don't care how you get it, through YouTube, through TVG, the Tesio Stakes at Laurel on Saturday. You got to watch that stretch run and Perform. Easily the best thing I saw all weekend. Let's talk a little bit about jockey news here as we wrap things up. Obviously, I mentioned Rad Ortiz Jr., a lot of controversy around his ride on Arabian Lion there at the end of the Lexington Stakes, coming over several paths to try to intimidate First Mission. Listen, I do find myself kind of caught in the middle here. It is a minimal amount of contact was made. Was there an intimidation factor? Absolutely. But since when is intimidation not allowed in horse racing? I mean, being able to intimidate is, I don't see a problem with it. It's when you're dangerous with it that I see an issue. I didn't think it was anything that was suspension worthy. I didn't think it was anything that was obviously worthy of taking Arabian Lion down. Those two were well clear of everyone else. And he ended up losing anyway. So, finishing second, I should say. So, I didn't think it was a big deal. But, it's one of those, whenever Irad does something like this, it's going to draw a lot of attention. It's going to draw a lot of heat. But that's just the way Irad rides. And now the problem is he does cross that line regularly, and he does make it dangerous all of a sudden. And when he makes it dangerous, then you got to take action. And that's where I think there's a lot of debate about. Sometimes organizations don't always take action against him when he is dangerous with certain tactics and things like that. So I didn't see a huge issue with it. I think he was trying to A, intimidate, and B, show Arabian Lion, this other horse that was coming up is inside. Arabian Lion was cooked by that point, so I didn't think it didn't make much of a difference. But like I said, it was a little bit of a controversy that people were talking about. Obviously, the other, I think, interesting note to make was the impact of jockeys this weekend. There are some people who just believe jockeys don't really make much of a difference. It's all about the horses. There are some people who think it's all about the jockeys and that, it's entirely in their hands. Again, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. But there were a couple of really big jockey upgrades. Chez Pierre, who I talked about before, in that Maker's Mark mile. But then Gam's Mission on Sunday, much better ride than last time out. And, listen, it's something where I've been critical of that Tampa Bay jockey colony. Not surprising, that's where those 2 horses came out of last time. There's some questionable rides down there that are given. I'll just say that. There's some really good jockeys. I don't want to throw shade at people. There's some really good jockeys down there. But when you watch Tampa on a regular basis, you do leave yourself scratching your head quite a bit when it comes to certain rides. And when you see these horses all of a sudden go to Flavia Pratt or Joel Rosario or Luis Saez or Irad Ortiz Jr., geez, they run a lot better. It's not that the horse got better. It's just that they keep the horse out of trouble. They ride the horse the way the horse deserves to be ridden, etc. So, jockeys make a big difference here. And you saw that with a few horses, I think, this weekend out there. Well, let's wrap up with a little bit of trainer news. And here is a tidbit for you folks. And I saved it till the end. But obviously, Charlie Appleby had 2 runners in Keeneland this weekend, Modern Games and With the Moonlight. They both finished second in respective Grade 1 races. It is the first time ever. Get this. It is the first time ever Charlie Appleby has lost consecutive races in the United States. The first time ever Charlie Appleby has lost consecutive races in the United States. My God. and it wasn't like they turned in clunkers. I had 2 seconds and 2 Grade 1s. They still are going home with a nice little paycheck. But that just shows you the dominance of his barn when they've been coming over. That the first time ever they've lost consecutive races. Absolutely incredible. Now, from Derby news standpoint, Todd Pletcher's duo of Forte and Kings Barnes have arrived at Churchill Downs. Obviously, Tapit Trice, I think, is already there or is still just a Keeneland maybe, and will be shipping over shortly. But obviously, all three of them in Kentucky ready. So those two have made it the trip up from Florida now to Churchill, and we'll obviously have updates about how they take to the surface and their workouts and things like that. Two Phils, the Larry Ravelli trained horse, is going to remain at Hawthorne until about 10 days before the Kentucky Derby. The Japanese horses, Continuar and Dermasotogake, have shown up at Churchill Downs. They are already there, taking to the track, etc. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot of publicity, a lot of focus on how they have taken to the track, how they work out, will they be forwardly placed, how are they being trained, etc. So a lot of exciting things to be talking about there in the coming weeks. Well, speaking of the coming weeks, we have a lot of content coming up for you this week. We have this fastest 2-minute series. It's a lot of fun. We have people from around the industry in 2-minute videos giving you their 5 answers to 5 Kentucky Derby questions. It's a lot of fun. We got, like I said, people from across the industry, Caitlin Free, Ken Rudolph. We got Gina Bacola, Barry Spears. We got just people from all over. We're going to get Sarah El Badwi. We got Bree Mott from Stable Duel. We're going to have a lot of people on this series. It's going to be a lot of fun, so make sure to check those out. Fun little vignettes to just watch 2-3 minutes long. We also have a Kentucky Derby first look video myself and Colin Sheehan are going to be doing. We got a spotlight series that El Hombre and Colin are doing, looking at individual horses and spotlighting their efforts, etc. Look for those starting this week. And then we also have some barn tours that are going to be starting up this week as well, with Colin and I going from barn to barn, Pletcher to Yakteen to Cox to other trainers, and looking at the Derby entries that they have, talking a little bit about their history in the Derby, etc. So a lot of great content there. And then finally, we'll continue to have stakes previews and capping the card coming up this week as well. So make sure to press that subscribe button here on YouTube to keep track of all the content that we have here on Trust the Profits. Make sure to follow me on Twitter at the handle at Fail to Menace. Until next time, friends, my name is Matthew DeSantis, wishing you a great and profitable day at the races and reminding you that it's now post time.